bee balm, bergamot, catnip, coleus, germander, horehound, hyssop, lamb's ear, lavender, lemon balm, mint, basil, marjoram, oregano, patchouli, salvia, chia, rosemary, sage, savory, self-heal, and thyme. Welcome to episode 47 of the Growing Space podcast. In today's episode, we are picking up with our Meet the Plant Families mini-series and talking all about the Lamiaceae plant family, or the mint plant family. I'm going to walk you through how to plant these, different characteristics of members of this family to help you identify them when you are out in the wild. One of the main reasons why I love doing this plant family mini-series is because I think it is so important for us to understand who all is related to each other in the plant world, because it helps us be better caretakers of our plants. So they tend to have similar growing habits and growing needs, growing practices, pest issues. So there's just so many benefits from understanding which plants are related to each other, because it deepens our knowledge of how to best care for them and best enjoy them, best eat them, etc. So I'm going to walk you through some different characteristics for how to identify members of this plant family. And then, of course, we're going to talk through the different things that you need to know to grow them successfully, including best harvesting practices for these herbs, how to feed these herbs, what kind of soil conditions need to be in place for these. And then, of course, we're going to talk about why these are such great companions. So in last week's episode, I gave a little teaser, a little overview, if you will, of companion planting. And so these members of the Lamiaceae plant family are fantastic companions for so many of our plants. So let's go ahead and tuck in and get started talking all about the Lamiaceae plant family.
Welcome to the Growing Space podcast. I'm your host, Farmer Erin, owner of the Patio Farmer, and I believe that no matter what size space you have, you can grow food at home. Tune in every Tuesday as I share my best tips, tricks, and encouragement for tending to homegrown edible plants. I'm here to support your food growing journey. The Growing Space podcast is sponsored by Plant Club by the Patio Farmer. Plant Club by the Patio Farmer is a monthly subscription service I started in 2020. It's a membership-based opportunity to take your growing journey to the next level. With 4 different membership options, you get to decide the amount and kind of support that's right for you. All Plant Club members receive access to my online community through a platform called Circle. Having access to this platform allows members to share pictures, ask questions, celebrate harvest, and get to know each other. All Plant Club members also have access to free seeds each month, along with information on how to plant and tend to their crops, with seeding instructions and downloadable resources from the Patio Farmer's resource library. Membership starts at just $14 a month. Join Plant Club today by visiting my website, thepatiofarmer.com/membership.
So let's start off with talking about how you can identify members of the Lamiaceae plant family. So I'm going to talk through the different characteristics, physical characteristics that you can look out for to help you identify members of the Lamiaceae plant family. The first characteristic I'm going to share with you, and I feel like for me personally, this was the most helpful characteristic to learn about members of this plant family to help me identify additional members of the plant family. And that characteristic is that if you look at the stems of any of these plants, so if you have a rosemary plant growing at home, if you have lavender or a mint or bee balm, basil, any member of this plant family, you will notice if you feel the stem that the stem is actually a square. right? So if you take your fingers and you rub your fingers along the stem, you're going to find 4 fairly equal sides of each stem with right angles on each corner. That is a common characteristic that unifies members of this plant family, is that they have those square stems. They also have, if you look at the leaves of these different plants, like your hyssop or your mint or your sage, savories, thyme, if you look at how the leaves form, they are simple leaves, meaning they're not, generally, they aren't like super lobed or like have a lot of texture. I know that there are some varieties within lavender that do tend to have more lobed leaves, but for the most part, like these leaves are fairly simple. They have fairly flat or smooth edges, right? We don't have a lot of like gaps and dips in our leaves, right? And they typically form in pairs. So on either side of that square stem, you will have 2 fairly identical leaves kind of mirrored from each other. So that's another characteristic. One more characteristic of members of the Lamiaceae plant family is the color of their flowers. So most of these herbs will bloom at some point. You know, if they're perennial, if you have them for a couple of years, they're going to produce a flower, which the pollinators love. Bees love the flowers of this plant family, and it makes me so happy when I see my herbs go to seed and produce that flower and all of the happy little bees in my growing space. But the color of the flower of members of the Lamiaceae plant family is light purple and white. So that's another way that you can tell if plant is a member of this plant family. Also, the flowers typically have 2 petals and they look like kind of like an open lion's mouth. Most of the time, these flowers are kind of form in clusters. So you'll have clusters of blooms that open up at once that are light purple, think like the color of lavender, to kind of a bright white. Think about a basil flower, an Italian basil flower. So there you go. Another fun characteristic for members of the Lamiaceae plant family. So if you have some of these herbs growing at home, and I'm guessing most of you who are growing food and listening to this podcast have these. So go out and take a peek at your plants and just see what you learn about all of these members and see if you can find their similarities, okay? Members of this plant family are native to the Mediterranean. So these are all Mediterranean style herbs. And when we think about the Mediterranean climate, it's fairly temperate, right? Because we're right next to that gorgeous, beautiful Mediterranean Sea. Oh, the Mediterranean climate is fairly temperate because of the water. There's also a lot of steep elevation changes across the Mediterranean coast. And it's typically like right up against the water. It's kind of rocky and relatively dry. So this is not a super humid, moisture-filled, minus where the water is, obviously, moisture-filled region. And so from that, we can deduce that when we're growing these herbs at home, we need fairly dry, not like totally dry, but like fairly dry conditions. So anytime we are growing these in a pot, we can use pots that are porous, that breathe. So if you have like a fabric grow bag that you want to try growing some herbs in, if you have a large terracotta pot that you want to try growing some of these herbs in, or, even like another kind of ceramic or a wooden container that you want to try planting them in, they will do beautifully for you in those pots. The biggest thing whenever you're growing in pots in general, with any plant, honestly, in my opinion, is that you need to have drainage holes. There needs to be an opportunity for water to escape, usually from the bottom of your container. Now, with these herbs, that becomes even more essential because they do not like having their feetsies wet. In other words, they don't like their roots to be sitting in water. For those of you who are brand new to listening, I am located in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am in the USDA Hardiness Zone 8A. If you want to know what hardiness zone you live in or what the heck a hardiness zone is, be sure to check today's show notes because I'll put some information in there for you. But here we have super, super dense, compact clay soils, which hold a lot of water, which typically works to our advantage. But as we're considering growing these herbs potentially in the ground, we need to be mindful of the amount of water that our native soils hold and just try not to overwater and not plant these herbs where we get super saturated soils. Now, in me just giving you that quick overview, I have thought of like 2 or 3 additional things that I need to share with you about members of this plant family. So the first thing to know is that within this plant family and within the edible members of this plant family, there are annuals and perennials. Now, most of the edible and medicinal members of this plant family are going to be perennial. And for those of you who need just a quick definition, don't feel bad. I always define these terms when I use them because who knows who's in the room. But a perennial plant is one that remains evergreen or returns year after year to grow again. So it's the same plant that either remains productive for us year round or will take a little snooze in the cooler seasons and then return to produce for us in the next season. Most of the members of this plant family, like I said, are perennial and are evergreen or everbearing, meaning sometimes they might have a little wane in their production, but for the most part, they're here for you and you should be able to harvest something from them throughout the year, at least in a moderate temperate climate. One of the annual plants in this plant family is basil. So basil, if you've grown basil before, then you probably already know this, but basil loves the hot summer weather. It loves the heat. It loves all of that delicious sunshine, just basking on it, giving it tons and tons of energy. That is when it is happiest. It does not like once we start getting cooler weather, like especially doesn't like a frost or a freeze. So basil, for most of us in the US, is going to be an annual. Now, something to keep in mind with perennials, and if you're planning on putting these herbs in a similar space or in the same space, you can totally do that. These herbs love to be planted together. They play nicely together. There are some exceptions. I'll get into that in a second. You might know where I'm going with this already. But for the most part, these herbs play really nicely together. And I like to compare them to goldfish. Let me explain. No matter if you're growing these in a pot or directly in the ground, what they do is they kind of sense who else is around them and they grow to whatever size space they are given. Kind of like goldfish. You throw a bunch of goldfish in a tank together and they are able to regulate their growth based off of who else is in the fishbowl, right? The exceptions to this kind of goldfish mentality is, of course, none other than mint itself. Peppermint, spearmint, pineapple mint, any mint, lavender mint, chocolate mint, any true minty mint, plus your lemon balm and catnip. Any of these members of the Lamiaceae plant family, notoriously speaking, do not play well together. We can truly commend these plants for being easily some of the most determined plants that we can plant at home to eat. They are so set on growing and they are super greedy and they love to just take up a space. They love to stretch out. They love to send up lateral roots and stems and be super productive in our spaces. So much so that I would encourage all of you, if you want to plant a mint, and not just members of the Lamiaceae plant family, but a true mint, spearmint, peppermint, etc., catnip, or lemon balm, that you only put this in a pot. Do not put it in the ground. Just a little insight for you on how mint and lemon balm and catnip like to grow. So they send out roots in all directions, all kinds of directions, but usually in a straight line. And those roots will grow and grow and grow until they hit something in the ground, like a rock or another plant's roots, or, maybe a retaining wall or the edge of your container, whatever it is. When they hit something, then they just turn and they keep growing. Now, the stems of the mint plant look almost identical to the roots of the mint plant. They have the same texture, so the roots are also square shaped. And what you'll notice on your mint, if you look carefully enough, is that at the very base where the stem comes up out of the ground, it's not like the central location. They kind of pop up everywhere, all across, all in the soil where they're planted. And that's because the stems and roots produce lateral roots from nodules or nodes on the stem itself. And usually on these nodules, there will be a leafing end and a rooting end. And the leafing end is what you see come up out of the soil to grow. And then right underneath that stem is a little root that grows down into the soil. Usually the nodules are like every 1 to 2 inches on the stem. So do the math. That is why mint is so prolific and so difficult to get rid of, because if there's just one nodule in the soil, it will grow another plant and then it will create new roots and it'll just go and go and go. I'll say it again because I feel like you can't say this enough. Grow your mint in a pot unless you really, 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 really love mint and you're super duper sure and you want it to be wherever you plant it forever and ever. When you're going to plant members of the Lamiaceae plant family, you can plant them fairly close together, right? You don't need a whole lot of space, but the bigger you want the plant to be, the more space you should give it. Going back to the plants not wanting to have their feet wet or their soil to be too moist, it's important that you have a nice, well-draining soil, well-draining native soil if you're going to be growing them directly in the ground, or a well-draining, high-quality potting soil to grow them in a pot. Because we eat the leaves and stems of these plants, it's important that the soil also have a high nitrogen content. Most store-bought soils are going to already be high in nitrogen when you buy them, so that makes it fairly easy. But if you are working with a native soil or an existing soil, it's important to introduce a little bit of compost or organic matter to your soil before you plant members of this plant family. Now, you can also use compost and a high-quality plant food as kind of a continual nutrition schedule for your established plants. If you're growing directly in the ground, you won't need to feed as often because your plants have more access to resources in the ground than if you were growing in a pot or container. If you're growing in a pot or container, it's a good practice to feed members of this plant family every 6 to 8 weeks throughout the year, year-round. And this just helps to stimulate growth and keeps them happy and productive and supportive for you. Some of my favorite composts to use are a mushroom compost or earthworm castings. Both of those are generally high quality products that are super supportive for your plants. I also like using all-purpose plant food as a way of providing additional nutrition, additional minerals for our plants throughout the growing season. And I'll put some links in the show notes for some of my favorite composts and plant foods for you that are high in nitrogen and would be good for members of this plant family. Now, also along the lines of maintaining adequate soil moisture levels, right? is it's a good practice to let your soil dry out if you can, right? So if you're growing in pots and containers, allow your soil to dry out almost completely before watering. That means you don't need to be watering members of this plant family nearly as often as other edible plants that you have growing in your growing space. I would say even in the summertime, like watering these plants 2 to 3 times a week is great. In the spring, fall, and winter, you could probably get away with once a week because they just don't need as much moisture in the soil to really thrive. The biggest issues that you would see with an oversaturated soil is root rot, which could lead to your plants being not super happy and dying off or dying back on you. So if you're noticing any like mushy leaves or loss of leaves and you feel like you might be overwatering, try to water either a little less or a little less frequently, a little less often, and see if that helps your plants. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind, or another thing to know about members of this plant family, is how they like to be harvested. Now, harvesting your herbs and pruning your herbs, which is something that you could do on an annual basis, is more or less the same thing. It's good to prune back your perennial herbs in the fall or do a pretty hefty harvest come fall. But as you are picking from them and using their leaves throughout the growing season, this is a form of pruning as well. These kind of suggestions or best practices that I'm about to share with you are good to keep in mind anytime you are harvesting or pruning these perennial herbs. So generally speaking, before I harvest any members of this plant family, I like to give the plant time to become established in the space that it's growing. So typically I wait anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks after planting. Oh, and when you go to plant members of this plant family, it is generally best to purchase a seedling for these plants versus starting them from seed, at least the perennials. So basil and maybe a few other ones like lemon balm does pretty well. Catnip does pretty well started from seed, but otherwise I would try to find plants for these because they are perennials. They can be even slower to grow from seed. So just do yourself a favor and find a great local plant store or farm or nursery or farmer's market vendor to support and purchase some great herb seedlings from them. Once you have your herbs planted, like I said, I like to wait usually about 4 to 6 weeks after planting to begin harvesting. Generally speaking, I'm looking for a plant that is somewhere between 12 and 24 inches tall before I start harvesting from it. These plants, they are going to be growing from the bottom up, obviously. And their main growing center is going to be the very center, truly, of the plant. So as it's growing, it's going to be pushing leaves out towards the outside of the plant. And so the lower down on the plant and the further out on the plant generally is where you are going to find the oldest and most mature growth. So I like to start there when I'm harvesting, and you can certainly just take leaves as you need. You can also take full stems as you need from these plants. They respond pretty well to either kind of harvesting. A couple of important things to know about harvesting is you always want to use a really sharp pair of harvest shears so you get a nice clean cut, a nice clean wound for the plant to mend and continue growing. And whenever you are harvesting or pruning, you want to make sure that you roughly, right, this is an estimate, but that you don't take more than 30% of the overall material, overall leaf that the plant has available at any one time. And the reason for that is that you just want to make sure that the plant has enough resources, aka stems and leaves, to continue growing without being too stunted or without getting too stressed. And that also goes for when you are pruning in the fall. When you're growing basil, there's a little trick that you can do. As the plant starts to produce a flower head, and that will form at the very tippy top of your stems. And it's kind of like this little cluster, this little matrix of leaves right at the top that will open up and bloom into bright white flowers or bright purple flowers, depending on the variety that you're growing. But as it does that, the plant is sending energy away from its leaves, away from its stems, and into that flower head. But we don't really eat the flowers, right? You certainly can, but we don't typically eat basil flowers. And so, as that plant is redirecting its energy, the leaves are going to change texture because they're not getting the same attention from the plant that they had been. They're going to maybe get a little tougher, and they might even get a little more bitter tasting. So, just a way to kind of tell the plant to redirect that energy into its leaves and keep your leaves nice and tender and sweet is to pinch off those flower heads. If you look at the plant and you can see there's usually like two sections of leaves right at the top, right underneath the flowering head. If you look below that to that second cluster of leaves that you find and you cut right underneath that, that will stimulate all kinds of new growth and it will help your basil plants grow more bushy and not quite as leggy. So that's something that I get asked about a good bit is how do I keep my basil short and bushy and compact and not as leggy? Or how do I just prolong the life of my basil? Because who doesn't love fresh basil throughout the summer? I do. I always want it as much as possible. Those are some tips for how to harvest, how to know when to harvest. If you do a big harvest, maybe in the fall when you're pruning, or you just feel like you need to train your herbs to grow a little more contained or whatever. If you're taking a lot of volume off of your plants, remember, you want to try not to take more than 30%. But if you are taking 30% off of a very established, mature herb plant, then you can maybe dry or preserve some of those leaves for later. Making a delicious pesto at the end of summer is a great way of preserving your basil. But for a lot of these perennial herbs, you can hang them upside down. You kind of cluster the stems together and you tie them up. And you can hang those clusters upside down in a cool, dark spot for about a month, maybe 6 weeks, maybe a little longer. But you want all of the leaves to completely dry out. And then you can separate those stems. You can even crush up the leaves a little bit. You can store them in an airtight container. Then you have homegrown dried herbs to use anytime you like. You can also make oil infusions and butter infusions with your herbs. You can make some tea blends. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about companion planting, and I definitely want to talk about that now. The reason why these plants make such great companion plants in our spaces is because of their fragrance. These herbs are known to be super oily and super duper fragrant, right? That's generally why we plant them. We like the smell of them. We like to use them in our cooking, obviously. And these oils, these flavor profiles are also super helpful at helping to keep pests away, specifically larger pests. So these strong smells there and the oils that come with the plant are enough to help keep squirrels and bunnies and chipmunks and even birds and deer, even deer away from our plants. And so when you are growing herbs, sometimes it is a good idea to have pots that you keep your herbs in. And I would say medium to large-ish pots, ones that are big enough to support your plants and help keep you from having to water excessively, which they don't like anyway, but a nice medium to large size pot, and maybe put one herb per pot, allow them to really get established, and then move them around as needed, or maybe move them towards the outer edges of your growing space to help keep out potentially unwanted visitors from your space. That's what I do at home. I keep all of my perennial plants, all of my perennial herbs, even my fruit trees and bushes, believe it or not, in big pots. And I have so many of them tucked in and around in every corner of my growing space. And we live in an area that has a lot of trees. And so our backyard is blessed with a lot of birds, a lot of bunny rabbits, chipmunks, squirrels. And I have never had like a devastating issue with any of those critters and my plants. And I really do think it's because of all of the herbs that I have growing and tucked in around all of my veggies. So maybe you give that consideration, a little noodle, that these herbs can be super powerful companion plants and super helpful in helping to keep away any of those unwanted visitors. And as I've already mentioned, when they go to seed, when they flower, they bring in all of the pollinators. And that is just like a double bonus for your plants that you eat the fruits of. So primarily your summer plants. They will benefit greatly, and thus you will benefit greatly from having more pollinators in your space when those perennial plants go to flower. I would like to go over this one common insect that can sometimes affect our perennial herbs on the members of the Lamiaceae plant family, and that is the whitefly. So let me just ask you a question. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to it, but I'm going to ask you this question anyway. Have you ever had a super well-established rosemary bush, shrub, and one maybe summer, early fall, you come out and you notice that your rosemary is now kind of starting to turn a little yellow, not like all over the plant, but some of the leaves, some of the needles are starting to show a little bit of stress. And there's like all of these little dots, maybe like a whitish, beigeish, yellowish set of dots on the needles on the leaves of your rosemary. Has that ever happened to you? What happens if you shake that bush, shake that shrub? Do you see a bunch of small white natty bugs flying out from underneath the leaves, needles of your rosemary? If yes, if this resonates, then you have probably encountered the whitefly, silverleaf whitefly. And this pest is very teeny tiny, and it likes to live underneath, or likes to hang out. I don't know if it necessarily lives there, but it likes to hang out on the undersides of your leaves. And it really likes members of the Lamiaceae plant family. So I've seen whiteflies on rosemary for sure, hands down. I've seen it on oregano. I've seen them on mint, even sometimes sage. And what they do is they hang out on the undersides of the leaves where they have lots of coverage and protection. And they stick their little proboscises, which is a fancy word for an insect mouth that has a built-in straw. It's got a sharp little edge on it. And they stick their proboscises in the bottom of your leaves, and then they start to just drink some of that delicious sappy goodness out of the leaves. They're after the sugar that's in the leaves of your plants. And then when they are done drinking, there's a little scar that shows up. And that's what you see on the tops of your leaves, is the scar from the whiteflies having sucked the sugary sweetness from the undersides of your leaves. So, what do you do about whiteflies? Well, especially on your perennial plants, because it's not like you're going to rotate those, right? So, something that you can use is either neem oil. If you feel okay using neem oil, you can certainly use neem oil, or you can use an insecticidal soap, or you can just use Dawn dish detergent. Yeah, I know. So if you get a concentrated version of neem oil, so neem oil concentrate, or you get a concentrate of insecticidal soap, you can mix about a teaspoon of those two products, or you can do a teaspoon of Dawn dish detergent. But you'll mix about a teaspoon of any product you choose, any of those three products that you choose, and 16 ounces of water in a clean spray bottle. And then you can use that in the morning or in the evening, and preferably when your plants do not have flowers on them. But you can use that spray and spray your plants down and try to control some of those whitefly populations. The reason why you want to do this when the when the plant does not have flowers and in the morning or the evening is because any of these products, whether it's neem oil, insecticidal soap, or just Dawn dish detergent, they are not only effective against treating whiteflies, which are an insect, but they will also treat or can be potentially deadly, right? Which is the goal with the whiteflies, but not necessarily the case for some of our other beneficial insects like bees and butterflies and pollinators. We don't want to accidentally get them stuck in the crosshairs. So in the morning or the evening, and not when it's super hot and sunny out either, it's best for your plants. And that can be a great way of controlling whitefly populations on your herbs, on members of the Lamiaceae plant family. I guess one other fun fact I can throw in here about the Lamiaceae plant family is that you can really plant these, with the exception of basil, of course, but you can plant members of the Lamiaceae plant family any time of year, truly, any time of year. As long as the ground isn't frozen, you can pop these plants in the ground, in the soil, and they'll be just fine. They're very heat tolerant, cold tolerant. You don't need to cover them up in the wintertime. They're totally great. So next week, we are going to be talking about the alliums. And the alliums are really a genus, so they're part of a larger plant family, the Amaryllidaceae plant family, or the Amaryllis plant family. So we're going to be talking about different edible members of the genus Allium within this plant family next week. And these are also a great companion plant for our growing spaces and great for planting in the fall, because that's the goal of picking up with the plant family mini series right now, is getting you ready for a productive fall growing season. And so members of this plant family and this genus, the Allium genus, are fantastic fall crops to consider for your space. And if you have listened to this podcast in the past, then you'll know that at the end of every episode, I like to share a fun little fact, fun little tidbit, morsel of information to sign off on. And this week, given that we are talking about fall, we are talking about the different plants that we can be growing in the fall, I wanted to give you a heads up and let you know when the fall equinox is going to be this year. In case you haven't looked ahead, the fall equinox is going to be on September 22nd of this year, of 2024. And that is a Sunday. And the equinox, of course, is also the first day of fall. And it's when our sun exposure, our experience of the day is equal to our experience of the night. It's the halfway point between summer and winter, and we're moving into more dormancy. As we shift and change seasons, there's a newness, right? There's a new time of year that's upon us, a new opportunity for a mindset shift and different practices that we can be considering in our growing space. Now, don't let me hold you back from drinking or eating anything pumpkin spice flavored before then. Lord knows I'm already seeing it out there, and it's early August. So anyway, I'm so glad that we shared this time together, and I hope that your summer crops are still bountiful and you're getting lots and lots of harvest from them. And I will see you again back here next week talking all about the alliums.
Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode of the Growing Space Podcast. I hope that you learned something new and that you were able to take this new information home with you and implement into your growing journey and into your growing space. As always, I am here to support you and your food growing journey. If you'd like to learn more about the different services and resources and membership programs that I run through the Patio Farmer, please check out my website, thepatiofarmer.com. You can also follow me on social media. I am on Facebook, Instagram, and oh my gosh, most recently, TikTok. Wow. I know. Here I am. Patio Farmer is on TikTok. It's very exciting. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a like or a rating or a review if you want. Maybe share a little comment about your favorite part of the episode. Share it with a friend. The more interactions I get with my little podcast online, the more I'm able to help people just like you in their food growing journeys. As always, thanks for being here, and I will see you again next week.